Hello. Let me check in with the next two chapters uh, of next two essays from On the Cusp of Contact: Gender, Space, and Race in in the Colonization of British Columbia. And starting off with number five: Taming Indigenous Sexuality, Gender, Power, Race in BC 1850 to 1900, which Barman really does a really good job of framing this story within the context of one of the perpetrators of sexual abuse, sexual violence against Indigenous women, Bishop Hubert O'Connor. A guy who calls himself a celibate man who was seduced by these Native women, and throwing his what seems like abhorrent, completely fringe, like a monster's philosophy, into a stark historical relief of saying, like, no, this is actually pretty consistent. This is a natural inheritor of how Native women, Indigenous women in British Columbia became conceptualized under colonialism. Um, you know, she starts off this essay saying, like, it's easy to be. We've been seduced as well. We've been seduced by the people who kept the records, the victors, who kept the records, which are men, and the male white colonizers, and how they conceptualized Indigenous women was as prostitutes, as fallen, as criminal, as Eves, basically, of the whole Victorian concept of that any female sexuality is illicit and needs to be controlled. It's all wrong. And if it isn't controlled, well, then it is illicit. It is prostitution. Um, and indeed, she quotes, she mentions Walter Benjamin of, like, maybe we're fooling ourselves trying to think we can read against the grain. But I mean, this is definitely a work here which is trying to read against the grain of the sources. Kind of digging up this idea of the Victorian, Victorian era attitudes towards female sexuality. That all female sexuality is illicit, and that showing very conclusively how this fear of female sexuality, of Indigenous female sexuality, was used to as an excuse or a justification or as a part of the ideology to destroy stuff like the potlatch and the longhouse, and then basically kind of the kind of the social glue that held together Native peoples, because in the view of both the government and the missionaries, that they saw this as a fallen, degraded, savages that needed to be, this all needed to be broken up, and it needed to get replaced uh, with the ideas of the singular basically nuclear family of a woman being contained in a private house. That was a really interesting thing that I didn't think I thought about before, but it's like we all live, like, as couples in individual houses, and that's very much used as a way of controlling women, at least at that point, because you can argue one way or the other. Women are actually able to go out, and I'm sure I'm way above my pay grade. Um, but yeah, the whole thing of saying, like, oh, the potlatch, they're selling the women for the potlatch, so you have to stop it then. Or the longhouse, it's a den of iniquity where, like, all these different groupings of males and females are things. So it's like bad stuff's gonna get up to it. There's really kind of just a heartbreaking thing of the fact that, you think about the missionaries, you think about the government officials, you think about probably economic interests all kind of aligning to want to um, clamp down on Native peoples and Indigenous women in particular, but also saying that the missionaries would enlist Indigenous men in their thing, in their in their quest to control the Indigenous women, saying that, like, they had to be kind of clamped down, they had to be controlled, they had to be kept on the reservations, they had to be kept in these educational schools, pulled away from their parents because they were, like, kindly but a bad influence on them, and they had to, so but they enlisted indigenous men in this, sometimes using it as a lure, like we'll get, like there's a paucity of females, so we're going to get you females by forcing them to be back on the reservation. All you have to do is convert to Christianity, and your reward is an indigenous woman. um, and keeping them there by force. Like there's the whole thing here of like flogging women, but also the idea of like the Indian agents going, well, we're already controlling everybody, and of course, if anyone who's a position of authority over a woman, which is of course a husband or a father or anyone like kind of male in the society, comes and says, well, of course we'll keep them. So there is that. So yeah, it was a really good essay by showing how that the conception of female indigenous women, conceiving them, um, forcing them into this box of illicit, untamed behavior, sexualizing them, um, a infected was something that seemed to infect all the men who came here. The otherness, the kind of the Orientalism idea of kind of the other, and it's a sexualized other. How that was such a destructive and corrosive thing on indigenous society, and how it continues to reverberate. And it's basically one of these things of, if you say that all these women are completely untamed, are sexualized beings, that basically that's open season on them. You're justified in doing whatever you can to control them. And if they seduce you, well, then it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter even if you're a priest, that of course you'll give in. Just like, and which is what brings you neatly back around to Hubert O'Connor, the guy who, and he died with his title, of the Right Reverend, uh, Bishop Hubert O'Connor. Unremote, no remorse, no thing. I actually did, found an article where he had actually ended up, instead of re-prosecuting him again, he was asked by actually the woman he assaulted in Williams Lake to come to participate in a healing circle, where he had to actually sit there and listen to the people that he had wronged, that he had hurt. Um, and I hope that helped the woman and that community heal, that they got to actually face him and tell him, even if it probably was just not none of it went in for him, but it was not about him. It was not about him. The second essay is Invisible Women, Indigenous Mothers and Mixed Race Daughters in Rural Pioneer BC, which kind of addresses this whole thing of there's kind of a myth of the white outsider pioneer woman, typified by a pioneer gentlewoman, Margaret Ormsby's memoir of Susan Allison. But this idea that, like, it was white settler women who were the foundation of the kind of settling of BC. You have all these guys come in, but you need the white settler woman to really set down roots. But what this seems to lead is all the indigenous women who were in long-term relationships with white men, and all the mixed race products of that, and the mixed race women who also were in relationships with these settler women, and how that kind of shifted over time, where it became less and less acceptable to have an indigenous or mixed race wife. How this was either hidden, or they were just sort of cast off. There's very much the thing here again of the sources of that the male historian was focusing on men, and was not focusing on their private lives and who they were married to, which kind of erased a lot of the indigenous and mixed race women in that. Um, Also kind of a focus here on, like, the products of these unions, of these mixed race children, where women were able to, like, either were able to pass, marry predominantly kind of white men, or mixed race men, and a small percentage of indigenous men, but kind of were going into the dominant society and kind of hiding in plain view. Um, and then the mixed race men who really were seemed to be screwed, like were had ended up on the very margins of society in non-racialized jobs, or ironically, one of the things that was open to them was bootlegging, of running alcohol to indigenous family members, because of the laws against that. But it really kind of strikes me as something of like, um, how certain groups get stigmatized. It's like Jewish people being like, oh, they're all bankers and stuff like that, because it's like, yeah, because they were that was one little slice of the economic place where Jewish people were actually able to find a niche where they were allowed to do something. They were forced into that by society. This wasn't because they were naturally going to be moneylenders. It's because the Christians couldn't. So they were forced into this, and then of course the dominant society then turned around and said, "Oh, you're all greedy," kind of all the horrible Jewish stereotypes were then reconfirmed them, which is like, that's the whole thing of the evil half breed who's running alcohol to native people. It's like, oh, it's like, no, it's because it's the one of the few niches where they could get. And yeah, think about all the evil half breeds that are in, and I half breed as being a very derogatory racist term in literature. Um, um, but there's also this thing of the effects of the Indian Act, again, kind of disrupting things, of saying like, we're going to accept your status as an Indian only if your father was a status Indian. If your mother was a status Indian, she loses her status, and none of her children can get status either. But there's this whole thing of a guy saying, you know, um, saying like, how hard his life has been. It's like, not white and not Indian, but we look Indian, and everyone but Indians takes us for Indian. It has been a complicated world. It's just like freaking heartbroken. But yeah, that and there's this wonderful play in here by mixed race writer Constance Lindsay Skinner, which sounds pretty melodramatic, but you get the definite sense of that whole thing of like, you get a woman who is like 1/8 native, but when that becomes known, she can't marry the guy she wants to marry, and the guy who she wants to marry kind of very weakly kind of falls away, at which point she accepts her fate but explodes into violence, which is unfortunately then kind of reinforcing the whole thing, this imaginary dangerous evil half idea of the half breed. um and it's like, Barman does a really good job of just going back to Susan Allison at the beginning, this memoir of the great pioneer white woman, but it turns out she is the second wife of the husband. um I'll have to look up his name for Sean. Not that Sean won't know it, but of his of he's the second she's the second wife, and he had a first wife with whom he had quite a number of children. Um, and it's interesting that, yeah, later on in life, the grandchildren from that first marriage come to Susan Allison, at which point she completely refuses to recognize that there could be any relation between her family and this first family that we're trying to make invisible in British Columbia. And yeah, great on Gene Barman for saying like, hey, things are a lot more complicated, a lot more nuanced, a lot more less pretty than we think they are. So yeah, that's the second essay, number 6, Invisible Women. All right, I think I will leave it there, and then I will try and do my check-in with Sean, who is such a better reader than I, and sent me a quote on Walter Benjamin, which was just like mind-blowing and sent me down a whole nother rabbit hole. All right, I will leave it there. More videos later.